We're rolling.
We're good, okay. Well, let's see. Where were we?
Not a quiz, is it?
Yeah, tests.
The last time we got together, it was in November. It was before Thanksgiving. But we're all still here. Okay, so thank you for coming. I know the weather's better, but it's still not. It's not great. But we're gonna do this. Let me take a couple of minutes to review where we've been. I know you remember every word, but just so we can have a little review. This is week 5 on your scorecard. In week 1, way back when, we talked about the Jewish roots of the liturgy, okay? And we looked at the synagogue service, the Passover meal, the Sabbath meal, the Last Supper, the Roman meal, the Greco-Roman symposium meals, okay? And we also looked at some of the very early roots of the Eucharistic prayer. We looked at a prayer called the Birkat Hamazon, which was one of the predecessors of the Eucharistic prayers, or as we call them, the anaphora. Then in week 2, we looked at the history. We started looking at the history of the celebration of the Eucharist. So we started with the home Eucharist. We looked at some of the church fathers, Ignatius of Antioch, Justin, Hippolytus, Tertullian, Cyprian, those bishops and saints who gave us either some of the Eucharistic prayers or talked about how the Eucharist was celebrated at their time. We were introduced to terms like the epiclesis, the calling down of the Spirit upon the gifts. We looked at the Gnostic theology of the Eucharist, which was eventually deemed to be heretical. And we looked at a whole variety of celebrations around the early church. Okay? Then in week 3, we continued that theme, looking at some of the primitive liturgies, the Eucharistic prayer of Addai and Mari, of Alexandria, of the other parts of Egypt, of Antioch, Jerusalem, Byzantium, Ethiopia, the Spanish liturgy, and then we looked particularly at the Roman liturgy, which took the shape that the Mass had for centuries around the year 500 CE. Okay? We looked at the French, or what was then called the Gallican liturgy, the liturgy of Milan, the Celtic liturgy, and then we also looked at the theology of the Eucharist and how it moved from typology to allegory. Typology, there is a type and an antitype. There is an illustration, and then its reappearance in the New Testament. So you have the sacrifice or the offering of bread and wine by Melchizedek in the 14th chapter of Genesis. Melchizedek appears for about 3-4 verses, and then he's gone. That's all we ever hear. But he offers bread and wine. Amazing. That is a type. And the antitype then is the celebration of the Eucharist or the Last Supper. Okay, if you recall that. And then that kind of devolved, went downhill into allegory, where every element of the Mass, every element of the Eucharist was somehow seen as an aspect, especially of the Passion of Christ. The Mass changed, the understanding of the Mass changed from a meal celebrated to honor Christian unity into a redoing, if you will, of the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary. Okay, so the theology of the Eucharist changed quite a bit, and then it was also allegorized. So a genuflection of the priest might be seen as the genuflections of the Roman soldiers before Christ, as they mocked him. I mean, it became almost ridiculous, the analogies that were drawn between the simplest of gestures and Christ's passion. The priest saying Dominus vobiscum, opening his arms, is like Christ opening his arms on the cross. And one symbolic action had no connection at all necessarily with the next one. Okay, so that marked a kind of devolution or watering down of Eucharistic theology. And then in week 4, last week, 3 months ago, we talked about some other developments in the liturgy. The beginning of the private Mass, that those who could afford it had their own chapels, sometimes had their own private priest. Okay? We talked about how the frequency of saying Mass exploded because more and more people had intentions that they wanted remembered. So I cited the example of Pope Leo III, who celebrated Mass sometimes 9 times in one day. Okay, and most of them would have been private masses. He and an acolyte, he and an altar server, or maybe he and a deacon, and that's it. We talked about the alienation of the congregation, where at first everyone is sitting around the table sharing a meal, and eventually there became this great distance. The communion rail and the elevation of the altar, so that the congregation became merely spectators. They were there just to watch what the priest was doing. It was the priest who was the focus of the Mass, not the congregation. The congregation didn't answer the prayers. The congregation didn't sing. It was the choir who sang. Okay? So people were disconnected from the liturgy. And so a part of that over time evolved into this thing where receiving communion, receiving the body of Christ, became less and less important. So people, the frequency of communion in the Middle Ages was probably like 3 times a year. It was replaced by this fixation on viewing the host. Looking at the host became the focal point of the Mass. And so that's when, the priest has his back to the folks now. That's when the elevation of the host became, came into existence. And there, for a while, in some places, none of this is universal. For a while, in some places, the elevation of the host would last for several minutes, so that everybody could get a good look at at Christ in the sacred bread. That, of course, then, this viewing of the host spread into other directions, like Eucharistic adoration, like 40 hours devotion, okay? So that people had more opportunities to view the host, okay? We looked then at the Reformation and the Catholic Reformation and the changes that were brought about, and we looked at the Baroque period, we looked at the 19th century, and then the modern liturgical reform that began in the early 20th century with some of the monasteries in Belgium and Germany, and flowered with the Second Vatican Council. And the way the Eucharist is celebrated now, with the altar here, with the priest facing the people, with taking communion in the hand, communion under both kinds, the sacred bread and the sacred wine, lectors, and the congregation singing, the congregation answering the prayers, the congregation offering the sign of peace. the bringing back of the general intercessions, the general prayers of the church. For a long time, that was done once a year, one day a year at the Easter Vigil. Now it's part of everyday Mass. Okay, that all came about through the Second Vatican Council. So that, in a nutshell, is where we have been. What I want to look at today are just some other kind of random elements of the Mass. And then in weeks 6 and 7, I want to walk through the actual parts of the Mass themselves. The opening procession, the introductory rite, the I confess, the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, the glory to God. We're going to take it step by step by step. Okay. Now, here we are. So the first thing I want to take a look at is what are some of the names of the Mass through the ages, through the centuries. So in the Acts, the first one is the breaking of the bread. And this is the term that appears in the Acts of the Apostles. And it refers to Jesus' action at the Last Supper. Remember I said whenever you see Jesus taking, blessing, breaking, and giving bread, that's a Eucharistic story. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, he takes, blesses, breaks, and gives. Whenever you see that, that's a Eucharistic story. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, they encounter Jesus, they don't recognize him. How did they come to recognize him? They recognized him in the breaking of the bread. Okay, so the breaking of the bread is one of the early terms for the Mass. Then the next one is the Eucharist, or in Greek, as I have it there, Eucharistia. It's been in use since the late 1st century, so it's a very, very ancient term for the Mass. The term in Greek, Eucharistia, refers to a prayer of thanks. Eucharistia means thanks, okay? It is specifically the thanks of the people of God that rises up to God. Okay, so Eucharist is a prayer of thanks. Next is oblatio and sacrificium. I'm sure some of you had Latin somewhere along the line, right?
Oblation and sacrifice.
Yeah, if David Sullivan were here, I might say that he might have lived at a time when Latin was still a live language, right? But that would have been a cheap shot, so I won't say that. But anyway, so very early on, the Eucharist came to be seen as an offering or a sacrifice, an oblatio or sacrificium. That was especially in the Western Church, but when I say Western Church, I mean Roman Church, but it didn't originate in Rome. It originated in North Africa, which was part of the Western Church. Okay? And so you see there, oblatio and sacrificium, already you see that shift from meal to sacrifice. And the altar came to be understood less and less as the altar where a meal is celebrated, and more as the altar of sacrifice, like the altar of sacrifice in the Jewish temple. Okay? In order to focus more on the sacrifice or oblation of Christ on the cross. Okay? Next one, Corbono. In the church in Syria, the word Corbono was used, and it means gift. It's a nice term. In some places, the Mass was simply called sacrum, the holy thing. Or the same word in the Ethiopian language is kedase. Or for Arab Christians, it was kudas. They all mean the same thing, the holy thing. The Mass, the Eucharist, is the holy thing. Dominicum. In North Africa and Rome in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Mass became referred to as the Dominicum. The Lord's. It belongs to the Lord. It is the action of the Lord. okay? Or it is the celebration of our Lord. Among the Greeks, the next term is liturgia. Among the Greeks, since the 9th century, 800s, the Mass has simply been called liturgia, or the liturgy. And liturgy is a word that we're familiar with as well. And then there is the word missa, which is the root of the term Mass. Okay? Since the end of the 4th century, the word missa has been used by the Roman Church, the Latin Church. The word missa comes from the Latin word missio, which means mission, and that word comes from dismissio. Okay? Dismissio means literally a dismissal. So what does the priest say at the end of Mass? Go. The Mass is ended. Remember in Latin, if you remember that, the priest used to say, ite missa est. Go. The Mass is ended. Okay? Because that's what the purpose of the Mass is. It's not for us to just be here and become spiritual and not care about the world. The purpose of the Mass is to gather, to be fed by the Word of God, to be fed by the Eucharist, by the bread and body, the bread and wine, by the body and blood of Christ, so that we can go out, we can be dismissed and go in mission in the world. And then after we are in mission in the world, we return to the Eucharist and we bring what we have learned and internalized to the Mass. We share that and then go back out again. So that there's always this dynamic tension of coming together and then going out into the world. And all of that is contained in that simple little word, missa, or the Mass. Okay? So it's a simple little term, but it's a very powerful term. It does not refer, by the way, to the mass gathering of people. That's the masses. No, it does not refer to that. Okay? It refers to the gathering that is then dismissed, that is sent on mission. Okay? All right, I have to do this because my little clicker isn't working. Oh yeah, well, I jumped the gun on that, but we'll get to that one in a minute. The next thing is the time of celebration of the Mass. When did that occur? So, in the primitive church, very early church, the Eucharist was celebrated always on Sunday. Why Sunday? When, if you recall, Christianity grew out of Judaism. Why wasn't the Sabbath celebrated on Saturday? It's because the Lord rose on the first day of the week, on Sunday. So the early Eucharist was seen as, a celebration of the resurrection. Okay, so it was celebrated on Sunday. This is noted already in the first century in the Didache. So that's the earliest we have. The Sunday obligation came into play as early as the 4th century, the 300s. Okay? But eventually, the Eucharist began to be celebrated on days other than Sunday for certain reasons. To honor the saints. The Mass was celebrated during Easter week. Remember, Easter is one of those celebrations that is not one day. There is an octave of Easter. And so Easter is literally celebrated for a whole week. It's celebrated for 8 days in a row. That came early on in the church, okay? So the celebration of Easter through the Eucharist continued through the whole week after Easter. And then Mass came to be celebrated daily during Lent. Beginning in the Middle Ages, and this surprised me, Mass was celebrated on Saturday evening, okay, and that fulfilled the Sunday obligation. Already in the Middle Ages, that surprises me, but there it is. I guess they must have used the Jewish idea that Sunday begins when the sun goes down on Saturday. That's still kind of the thinking, that Sunday begins when the sun, although at 5 o'clock daylight savings time, the sun hasn't gone down yet. But anyway, that's still the idea. The daily celebration of Mass didn't begin until about the 4th century. Okay, and most people did not attend daily Mass until the 8th century. As the Eucharist became more and more disconnected from the meal, the time of celebration of Mass during the day, expanded. So by the 6th century, by the 500s, Mass on Sundays was normally celebrated at what they called the 3rd hour, which is 9 o'clock in the morning, more or less. And this became the time for daily Mass as well. Mass was probably for a long time celebrated later in the day because there was a meal connected with it. And, that disconnection occurred by the year 200, but probably the time of celebration stayed relatively fixed until much later. Okay? Became earlier. But since the late Middle Ages, the time for Mass has been flexible. Now Mass can be celebrated literally any time, during the day or night. Okay. This is another little fun fact that I learned in preparing for this. The Christmas midnight Mass, began in the Middle Ages in the city of Venice. So, small little fact, but now you know where midnight Mass began, okay? As long as there was no flood, I suppose, okay? Let's see. All right, now, next thing. Worship space. Where is the Eucharist celebrated? Now, this comes into play. One of the innovations of the Christian movement, one of the innovations was the departure from the practice of worship at designated locations. So, either mountains or groves or temples or shrines, worship took place at specific sacred places. Now we have these folks celebrating, worshiping in the home. That's an innovation of the Christian movement. So home liturgies, they were the norm at least through the end of the 2nd century. That became more and more difficult as there were more and more Christians. You needed a bigger house. So, my house wouldn't have worked for more than about, 20 or 25, and half of us would have been standing. But if we go to the Costco's, we could have, Mass in their ballroom, which would seat, 100 or 200, So, isn't that right?
Oh, you got it.
Okay. So, but besides being celebrated in the homes, Eucharist was also celebrated in cemeteries. Very early on, the connection between honoring the dead and the Eucharist, especially honoring the martyrs and the Eucharist, it came about. That became a big focus. And the Eucharist was even celebrated at times in prisons for those who were imprisoned for their Christian faith. Must have been probably a little risky to do that, at least at certain times. Church architecture, moving on. Yeah, there we are. There is a celebration in the catacomb. Now, notice the difference between the home liturgy and Mass in the catacombs and this. In the 4th century, church architecture changed drastically. When the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the empire in the early 4th century, he turned over some of their courts of law and their palaces, these basilicas. He turned them over to the church, and he actually had a lot of basilica churches built for the Christians. obviously Christianity was gaining huge traction. And so the basilica had been, as I said, the hall of the king. And the basilica, the architecture of the basilica was based on the ancient court of law. So you have the long, nave here, and you have, where the judge would sit, or the king would sit, and he sat up on a raised dais, or up on a raised platform. So you can see how this would accommodate itself quite well to, at least for us, we can see how it accommodates itself quite well for worship. Okay, so this is a quote, but something was gained and something was lost in this transition. And there's an author, a scholar named Richard Giles, who says this: the type of building previously associated in every town with the dispensation of law and now became synonymous with the Christian assembly. So what had been the place where the law was adjudicated was now the place where Christians worshiped. So it's easy to see how Christians would make the association between the church and law and order. Okay? That's the transition that took place. Churches at this time were sometimes built over the graves of the martyrs. St. Peter's Basilica is built over the spot where St. Peter is buried. Is it Peter and Paul both? I believe it might be both of them. Well, but at least that it's where St. Peter is buried. I remember I've been to St. Peter's Basilica once, and you kind of, back then, this was 1973, you look down into a kind of a hole, and there's a little red light down there, right, Barb? And that's where St. Peter is buried, and the basilica is built over his grave. That's the second St. Peter's Basilica, though. Okay. Let's see. The church building began to be thought of as a ship. Why is that? It's because the church became known as the bark, B-A-R-Q-U-E, the bark of Peter, the ship of Peter. And so the church became, was associated with a ship, a navis in Latin, and a V-I-S, navis. And so that word navis is where we get the term nave. This is the nave of the church, and that's where that comes from. Churches were frequently built facing east as a ship sailing toward heaven. Heaven was in the east. Okay? What else? In the province of Gaul, which is now France, churches and altars were actually both baptized and confirmed. So they were sprinkled with water and they were anointed with oil. So churches and altars received those sacraments. Okay? Originally, altars were made out of wood. I mean, they were tables, but before fairly early on, by the 4th century, they became built out of stone, because less and less they were viewed as the table of the Last Supper, and more viewed as the altar of sacrifice. Okay? The focal point of the sanctuary, imagine this. So you have the judge, sitting here, and he's the focal point of the basilica. Who became the focal point of the basilica churches? Well, it was the bishop. And so the bishop's cathedra, the bishop's chair, was a place of prominence. And you see that in Episcopal churches. When I say Episcopal, churches where bishops, preside, you see that even now. There is maybe a top over it, and it's fancy. It might be made out of stone. Okay, it's a place of honor. Okay. Also, to separate the sanctuary from the nave, altar railings and steps were added by the 4th century. However, at this time, most people did not worship in great big old churches like this. Most people, because they lived in little villages, oops, there's the Episcopal chair. There's an example of a cathedra. I need to rehearse my slides more often. Most people worship in much smaller churches like this one, parish churches. These churches typically sat no more than about 200 people. Okay, they were far more modest than the basilicas. The pulpit might be decorated with symbols of the sacraments. Above the altar, there might be a crucifix with both Mary and John standing at the base. The front of the altar might have a sculpture of the Last Supper. The back wall of the church might have a fresco of the Last Judgment, like the Sistine Chapel does. Okay, there's the Last Judgment, back there, frightening thing. The windows might be stained glass, if they could afford it, which would have pictures of the saints, the apostles, the prophets, and scenes from the Gospels. The windows were actually these stained glass windows were actually one of the earliest catechetical tools, because a catechist would take the kids to the church and show them either a statue or a window and say, see, that's St. Thomas. Let me tell you the story of St. Thomas. This is the Virgin Mary. This is St. John. On the altar at my home parish in St. Louis, St. Mary Magdalene, had on the altar images of the 4 evangelists, the ox and the eagle and the man and the other one. And I learned early on, although I've forgotten, I've learned that those were symbolic, that, each one of those figures meant something. It was a reference to one of the 4 evangelists. Okay. Until the time of the Middle Ages, the altar was still fairly accessible to the people, but eventually it became less and less accessible. It's a little bit hard to see. And that too is in St. Peter's Basilica. The altar became, the focal point. And the altar here actually has almost like a building around it. That's called the baldacchino. And there are still some churches that have a baldacchino. I worked for a while at St. Ambrose Church on the hill, and there is a baldacchino around the altar there. And you can probably think of other churches that also have one. Okay? All right, so that's that. Next thing I want to get into, and how am I doing on my time? So far, so good. Good. Let's talk about the participation of the people in the Eucharist. As you know by now, in the earliest church, the faithful gathered right around the altar, around the table or around the altar, and they offered up the Eucharist with the priest. Okay? Everybody except catechumens and pagans. Catechumens and pagans were welcome, but they were not welcome for the liturgy of the Eucharist. They had to leave. Why? Because they did not yet share the fullness of the faith. And so they, after the liturgy of the Eucharist, it's, bye-bye, wait till you get baptized. Okay. I thought this was kind of a fun little point too. In the Syrian church, as soon as Mass started, the deacons went and locked the doors. So you better not be late. Okay? However, the people who were inside said a prayer for those folks who didn't make it in. So that's nice. But they locked them out. That's not very nice. Okay? So you better show up on time. Don't oversleep, okay, when it's time for Mass. For a long time in the Roman Church and the Church in France, in Gaul, people were allowed to leave before communion. And that's because the announcements, and I guess announcements have been part of the liturgy forever and ever, the announcements were made right after the Our Father. So it was, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. There will be bingo next Sunday. Can you imagine that? So sounds odd to us, right? And after the Our Father, they made the announcements, and then they would give a special blessing to those who were leaving. The reason for this is that there was a general impression at this time that people had fulfilled their obligation simply by hearing the readings, that was enough. That broke down, over time, and then there became this fixation with looking at the host, okay? So the way they dealt with that is the priest would say from the altar that you have not fulfilled your Sunday obligation unless you stick around for the consecration, at least for the consecration. Not for communion, but at least for the consecration. All right? In the earliest times, the congregation responded to the prayers of the priest. The Lord be with you, and also with you, or with your spirit. This was a custom that was inherited from the synagogues. And this, dialogic part of the Mass continued until about the year 1000. After that time, the congregation didn't respond at all. The only people who responded were the altar servers. Okay? So by then, the congregation are strictly spectators. This is why, over time, the practice evolved of people saying the rosary during Mass or praying their own prayers during Mass. What had been a congregational service became a very individual service, right? This is my Mass, and I'm saying my prayers during my Mass. Well, that's because, the congregation was completely disconnected from what was going on up here. Okay, very early on, the congregation also participated by singing. They would sing "The Lord Have Mercy." They would sing the response to the first reading. They would sing the Holy, Holy, and they would sing the Lamb of God. Okay? Eventually, though, this all got turned over to the choir, so there was no singing by the congregation. Is it any wonder why Catholics are not as good? Well, this parish is very good, but some churches, nobody sings. But if you've ever been to a Lutheran or a Methodist service, good Lord, everybody is singing and everybody knows the songs, and they're great singers. We are not. By and large, we are not. St. Nicholas is really one of the exceptions to the rule. We were trained not to sing, and then we were suddenly told to sing. My dad, God rest his soul, would sing, but he shouldn't have. He really shouldn't have. He couldn't. What do they say about carrying a tune in a bucket? Right? Couldn't do it. What else? The offertory procession, the carrying forward of the gifts, lasted for about 1,000 years. But then around the year 1000, that disappeared. It disappeared for another 900 plus years until it was brought back by Vatican II. There was no idea of bringing the gifts forward, the people bringing the gifts forward, okay? The folks, the people, could not even touch the sacred vessels, right? The chalice or the ciborium, much less touch the host. That just didn't happen. The sign of peace, the kiss of peace, part of the very early Eucharist, it was done away with until the Second Vatican Council. In the earliest days of the church, the primary posture of the folks was to stand. Why? Because there were no pews, there were no benches, there were no kneelers. Okay, so everybody just stood. St. Peter's Basilica has no pews, does it? I don't think it has. I don't think it has pews. I think it's all wide open. I know because I do remember this. Notre Dame, I think, does not have pews. Or am I wrong? Tell me if I'm wrong. Well, if it does, it does. Okay, thank you. If it does, there was a time when it didn't. Okay, and everybody just stood.
That's
okay.
why you left early.
Yeah, feet got tired, right? Is it time for the announcements yet? Let's see. Yeah, I've already said all of that. All right, so there we have the posture of the congregation. Next point, the frequency of reception of communion. Okay? Up until the 4th century, it was the practice or the rule that the faithful would receive communion at every Mass. Why would you not? It was a symbolic participation in the meal. It was the beginning of the meal. And so, yes, you would go to communion, you would receive communion at every Mass. On Sunday, families would even take communion home with them to be taken throughout the week. Okay, so you didn't come to Mass every day, but you brought the Eucharist home with you and consumed the sacred bread at home. Starting around the 5th century, there was a huge fall off in the reception of communion. To the point where in Gaul, in France, there was a synod early in the 500s that said that the faithful had to go to communion at least 3 times a year. No more than that, but you had to go at least 3 times a year. Part of that too, and I haven't touched on this yet, was this growing feeling of unworthiness on the part of the faithful. Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, enter under my roof, right? That was fed in part by the theology of the day, which said that we as humans are inferior to, the life of the Spirit in heaven, and we as humans are somehow sinful. Okay, we are born in sin. That kind of theology was taught by St. Augustine and others, and was bought into by the church. The celibates, the virgins, they were considered superior. Their state in life was considered superior to those who were married. Their life was considered more spiritual because they were not sexually active. So even the act of sex was considered, you have to, because we have to, keep the human race going. But it could easily lead itself to sin. Okay, so there is this growing sense of the unworthiness of the faithful to receive the body of Christ, and they had to be told, you have to do this at least 3 times a year. Okay. Okay. In the Middle Ages, there was another barrier. In fact, there were several barriers. The church didn't help itself if it wanted its people to go to communion more often. In the Middle Ages, there was a directive that persons had to go to confession every time they went to communion. Before every reception of communion, you had to go to confession. There were other restrictions too that came up over time in different places and at different times. Women were discouraged from receiving communion during their menstrual period. Married couples were expected to abstain from sex for as many as 30 days before receiving communion. Fasting for half a week In some places, you had to fast for 3 or 4 days before you could receive communion. In some places, you had to abstain from meat for 6 days before you could receive communion. Well, man, no wonder, right? So, what were the outcomes of this? Well, I've already talked about one of them. It became more important to view the consecrated host than to receive the consecrated host. And the other idea that kind of evolved was this idea of spiritual communion. Okay? That a spiritual communion was attending Mass, looking at the host, and contemplating Christ's passion. The spiritual communion made me think about the childhood spiritual bouquets. Remember that? We used to give Mom a spiritual bouquet for Mother's Day, right? Mom, I will say 10 Our Fathers and 10 Hail Marys and 10 Glory Bees for you. But that's not the same as the spiritual communion, but that's what popped into my head when I saw this idea.
And the spiritual communion is back now for those who are back in church from home. Seriously?
It is back. Where did you hear about it, Barb? Wait, let me say this for the sake.
Mass remotely, the virtual Mass.
Yes.
During communion, the spiritual prayer comes up for those who aren't able to receive communion.
Okay, so for the sake of the camera, Barb is talking about spiritual communion now that Mass is virtual, live streamed and all of that there is a prayer that one can say during communion.
Right, it shows up on the TV, on the screen.
Okay, so the idea of spiritual communion is making a comeback. We hope it's not a permanent thing. It won't be. Once we get vaccinated, we'll be back, right?
Right.
Let's see. There was another practice of receiving communion for somebody else. Okay? Especially receiving communion for someone who had died. I'm sure that was thought of as a way of helping them make it through or shortening their time in purgatory. Right? So if they, I guess receiving the grace of communion for the sake of somebody else. Okay. After the Council of Trent was from 1545 to 1563. After the Council of Trent, and the Council of Trent was called as the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation, the reform of the Church in light of the Protestant Reformation. The Council of Trent encouraged more frequent reception of communion. It didn't really work. And as late as the early 20th century, Pope Pius X encouraged more frequent reception of communion. Okay? And then one other thing about reception is the Eucharistic fast. So in the early church, communion had to be the first food of the day. So the fast was from midnight. It was formalized in 1570 by Pope Pius V, not Pius X, but Pius V, that you had to fast from midnight before until you received communion. That was the case when I was a kid. And then in the 1950s, the fast from 1570 until the 1950s included water. No brushing your teeth, no drinking water, no nothing. The first thing that was in your mouth that day was the Eucharist. Okay? In the 1950s, Pius XII said it's okay to have water. Okay? And then the Eucharistic fast was shortened from midnight until 3 hours. And then it became 1 hour. Food only, water always okay. And we can take our medicines and all of that kind of thing. So that's the evolution of the Eucharistic fast. Okay. Next is Eucharistic Devotions. The Eucharistic Devotions began very, very early on, and they were an offshoot of the veneration of the cross on Good Friday. So, why were the Eucharistic devotions begun? Really one of the main reasons was that it was a way of affirming the humanity of Christ. Let me back up. I'm talking about the Eucharistic, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the veneration of the cross on Good Friday. Why was that practice initiated? That practice was initiated to affirm the humanity of Christ. Why the need to affirm the humanity of Christ? It's because there were many Christians in the early church who denied the humanity of Christ, who said that Jesus was only God and not a man. Okay? There were some Christians who believed that was not actually Jesus who was on the cross. One small group of Christians believed it was Simon of Cyrene, but that he looked like Jesus. And when you think about it, their thinking is not ridiculous. Their thinking was this: if Jesus was God, how could God die? That was a real problem. If you're thinking about a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and, eternal, how could God die? That was their thinking. So the church said, of course, that Christ was true God and true man, fully human and fully divine. And those affirmations in the creeds are there to hit home that point. Why, in God's name, in the creed, why would they say that Jesus, why would you include the mention of Pontius Pilate, this terrible human being, right? Suffered under Pontius Pilate. It's because the early church wanted to make sure that people understood that Jesus was truly a human being. He was not a God who was putting on a human costume. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. They are hitting that point, all right? And so the veneration of the cross, to go back to where we were, it is a way of affirming the humanity of Christ. Why does the cross in Catholic churches almost always or usually bear the figure of the corpus of Christ? That's why. To affirm the humanity of Christ. If you notice in a lot of Protestant churches, the body of Jesus is not on the cross. And that's because there's more focus not on the cross, but on the resurrected Jesus, the risen Jesus. Okay? Not so much here. If you're ever driving in a town that you're not familiar with, and you're looking for a Catholic church, look for the one that has the figure of Christ on the cross. Chances are that's your Catholic church. Okay? Now, who is this? This is a woman named Egeria. Egeria is a woman who made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the 4th century. And we still have an account of her. She wrote a journal, and we still have it. I don't know if we have the original, but we still have the account of her journey through the Holy Land. Pretty fascinating. She actually reports that the veneration of the cross took place in the church, among the Christians, in the Holy Land, in the 4th century. So it dates back at least that far. Egeria is there aren't many women who, are held up or are noteworthy in the early church. Egeria is one of those exceptions, and her words, her journal actually survived. She's an interesting character. The veneration of the cross, then, evolved into more than just veneration itself, but devotion to the cross came to include the devotion to the 5 wounds of Christ. The 5 wounds symbolized Jesus' humanity: his hands, his feet, his side. Okay? And as I've already said, this is why the cross became a central symbol in churches in the first 2 centuries of the Christian era. The cross was not the primary symbol of Christianity. Okay, when they look for ancient Christian graffiti, scratchings on the catacombs and all that, you don't see the cross until around the 3rd century. The cross does not appear as a symbol of Christianity. Okay? I've already talked about this fixation with looking at the host. Okay? And that led to the practice of elevating the host after the words of consecration. To see the host in the eyes of the faithful was to look upon the humanity of Christ. Okay? This was called communion of the eyes. This became more important than the actual reception of communion. The communion of the eyes. And then by the 13th century, this fixation with viewing the host evolved into Eucharistic devotions outside of Mass. Benediction, Corpus Christi processions. I don't know if in your parishes you had Corpus Christi processions as a kid. We did, and St. Ambrose on the Hill still does. There was a Corpus Christi procession through the streets of the hill. 40 hours devotion, if you remember that. Okay, I can remember having my hour of sitting in church, and I remember my dad signing up for 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. or something like that. It was there were people in that church for the entire 40 hours. It would begin on Friday and end on Sunday. And Eucharistic adoration. Okay, all of those practices evolved out of this thing about viewing the host. Okay, viewing the sacred body of Christ. All right. Next point is the relationship between the Eucharist and the relics of the saints. Okay? I've already said that in the earliest days of the church, it was quite customary for altars and then basilicas to be built over the tombs of the saints. At times, they would actually disinter the saint or the martyr and put their remains inside the altar, okay? Or they would put the relics, the bones of the deceased, the saint, in a box. Like that. Called the confessio. It was like a miniature tomb, a miniature sarcophagus. By the Middle Ages, it was you could not consecrate an altar unless there were relics in it. And I'm 99% sure that this altar and all altars now have relics in them. Okay, it's a practice that continues to this day. And I don't think this is the case anymore. But there was a time when if a priest celebrated Mass, let's say a home Mass or whatever, he would have the cloth, the corporal, that would have a little relic in it. Okay, so this connection between Eucharist and relics goes way, way back, and it's very, very serious. Okay. But this I thought was an odd practice. With the proliferation of churches and monasteries and all that kind of thing, the demand for relics grew. And so sometimes consecrated hosts were used as relics or were used in lieu of relics. It seems a little bit odd here. Okay? So that's that. How am I doing? Yeah, we're good. I'm going to make it. I'm actually going to make it to the end of my notes. All right, let's talk next about the role of women in the church. So, first point. There is evidence, and this person here is a woman. There is evidence that women were prophets. That was a status like bishop, presbyter, deacon, prophet for the first 150 years or so. Or I shouldn't say that. Until about the year 150, a prophet was an official, office in the church. So there is evidence that women were prophets, priests, deacons, even bishops. Okay? In the early church. If you want to take it all the way back to Jesus' time, there were women who had very important roles in his movement. It seems clear, for example, that Mary Magdalene, if you look at the 8th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, verses 1 through 3, that Mary Magdalene, there's a couple other women named, and it says that they provided for the disciples out of their means. So they were financial backers of Jesus' movement. Paul, too, had several women in places of importance. For example, there was a woman named Lydia who helped to found the Christian community in Philippi. You can find her in the 16th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. Mary, the mother of John Mark, presided over a house church in Jerusalem. If she presided over the house church, she was the celebrant of the Eucharist. Okay? Another woman, Aphia, led a house church in Colossae. Here's some others. Nympha in Laodicea, Lydia in Thyatira, in the town of Thyatira, and a woman named Phoebe at Cenchreae. So here's an inscription from Egypt, and it comes from the 2nd or the 3rd century, and it reads like this. Artemidoras, the daughter of Mikados, fell asleep in the Lord, her mother, Peniskianes, being a presbytera. A presbytera is a priest. Okay? But that didn't last very long. By the middle of the 2nd century, and this was the key cultural change within Christianity. By the middle of the 2nd century, Christianity began to distance itself a little more from Jewish thinking and ally itself more with Greek thinking and Greek culture, which was prevalent in the Roman Empire. That's a critical shift, and I won't go into it. That's a critical shift in the mindset of Christianity. Okay? So one of the things that the church, or the Christian movement, I think you should still call it at this point, is that it accepted the Greek idea that divided society into the public sphere and the household. The public sphere, the polis, okay? And the household, the oikos. The polis, the public sphere, was the domain of the men. The household was the domain of the women. All right? A second part of Greek culture that became part of Christian thinking was that a woman who took a leadership role in the public sphere, in the polis, was seen as compromising. She was seen as vulnerable. her sexuality was compromised. She was, in a sense, displaying herself, okay, for public view. All right? She was expected to be chaste, and if she participated in the public sphere, she was loose. Okay? She was expected to be available only to her husband. And her participation in the public sphere put that at risk. If you think about it, that's not a lot different from Orthodox Jewish thinking. And I'm thinking of my friend who you may have seen before, Rory, who spoke to us over in the hall. And she covers her hair in public, and that's out of respect for her husband. The practice of Muslim women covering the face, covering the hair, wearing very unrevealing clothing is that she should not be a temptation to other men. So there is a connection here. It's very sexist, but it was there. Okay? So once the Eucharist moved out of the home and into the public space, then women were seen more and more as not appropriate celebrants. Does that make sense? So that's part of it. Another part of it comes from fathers of the church like Irenaeus, who lived in the late 2nd century and into the 3rd century. Irenaeus was one of the main proponents of unity within the church, that the church should be one, that there should be one scripture, that there should be one priesthood, that there should be one focus of authority, and that's in Rome, okay? And so for him, one priesthood meant male only, okay? And that idea carried the day. So by the time of the 3rd century, there may have been, women still celebrating into the 3rd century, but over time, the practice of women having an ordained, if you will, role in the church disappeared. Okay, and accompanying that is the downplaying of certain women and the raising up of other women in the Bible. So on the one hand, you have the elevation of Mary, the Virgin, as the ideal of womanhood, right? And at the same time, you have the denigration of a woman like Mary Magdalene, who came to be considered, even though she's not, came to be considered the repentant prostitute. Okay? In a sermon given by one of the popes in the year 591, I don't remember the name of the pope, but I remember it was his 23rd sermon. He said that he conflated Mary Magdalene with the woman in the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Luke who had been a woman of ill repute and who came and washed, Jesus' feet with her tears and dried them with her hair and all that. This pope said that's Mary Magdalene, that she had been a woman of ill repute. She had been a prostitute, but then she was repentant. I grew up in St. Mary Magdalene Parish, and that was the story we had always heard about St. Mary Magdalene. Okay, so she was an example of what a woman should not be. Mary was the example par excellence of what a woman should be. Okay? So, enough about that. Next is the liturgical cycle. The begins in Advent, and then the Lenten cycle and Easter and then ordinary time. The liturgical year, the liturgical calendar, began with the establishment of the date of Easter. The date of Easter was not a foregone conclusion in the until the year before the year 200. Okay, there was a conflict between those who said that Easter should be tied to the Jewish calendar and tie it to at least 3 of the 4 Gospels. So it should be celebrated on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, the day when Jesus rose, and those who did not. So that would have meant that Easter could be celebrated on a Tuesday this year, and Thursday next year, and Friday the year after that. Okay? The church, well, there were others in the church who wanted Easter always to be celebrated on Sunday. That's the day when Jesus rose. And that actually spawned a controversy in the early church. There was a bishop of Rome who tried to enforce, this Sunday thing on everybody. And Bishop Polycarp came and said, no, don't do that, let it go. But then a later pope, maybe 40 years later, a later bishop of Rome said, no, this is what it's going to be. And where they came up with the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, that's how the date of Easter is determined. I'm not sure where that formula came from. Okay? All right. So that's the beginning of the liturgical calendar. After that came the idea that if we're going to celebrate Easter, there should be a time of preparation for Easter. And that's the season of Lent. And along with that came the Holy Week observances, the celebration of Holy Thursday and Good Friday. That was added to the calendar. Then in the 4th century, another part of the liturgical calendar had to do with the Christmas cycle. Okay? Advent was added as a 4-week preparation for the season of Christmas. And Epiphany was established as January the 6th. Christmas has not always been celebrated on December 25th. I mean, nobody knows what the day Jesus was born. And in the early church, it kind of moved around because they weren't sure. It was celebrated in March, it was celebrated in April, but finally it was decided that it would be celebrated on December 25th, which is shortly after the winter solstice. It was tied to a pagan festival of light. And so just as after the winter solstice, the light is beginning to return, the days are getting longer, so it is at Christmas that Jesus, the light of the world, enters the world. Okay? And then from there, more and more feasts were added. The feasts of martyrs and virgins, and then also a number of feasts honoring Mary, and feasts of the apostles. Okay, so that's how the liturgical calendar, or the liturgical cycle, came into existence. Last thing. Vestments. So where did our vestments come from? Well, let's go back to the beginning. In the home liturgies, of course, everybody just wore their own clothes. But clothes then were togas and robes, right? Tunics and things. So you can see the beginnings there. When the basilicas came into use in the 4th century, the celebrants wore what were then the formal clothing of the time. Okay? They wore a floor-length tunic called the alb. Father Bill, wears an alb when he celebrates Mass. The alb was held together at the waist, and I don't know if he does this or not, by a kind of rope type thing called the cincture. Okay? And over the top is this vestment called the chasuble. The word chasuble actually means a little house. And then originally the celebrant would wear some kind of towel around his neck to wipe the sweat off. That towel became formalized as the stole. Okay? Later on, two other vestments were added. One was the maniple that was worn over that. That kind of replaced the stole, I think, as the towel, because that's where the maniple came from. That was another thing to wipe your brow. That was pinned to the left arm. And the very first vestment that the priest would put on was a rectangular piece of cloth with string on it, or material, called an amice. And he would put that on and then bring it around his back and tie it up here. Then put on the alb. Very few priests that I'm aware of wear the amice or the maniple anymore. But once in a while you will see that. So over time, clothing styles change. But the priest's vestments did not. Okay? So one of the scholars that I looked at in preparing this, Joseph Jungmann, says this. This is how he characterizes our vestments. Now, our liturgical vesture is nothing else than a stylized form of the holiday attire of the imperial days of Rome. So that's where we've come. The vestments are actually borrowed from the clothing of the late Roman Empire. So there we go. How much? We still have a few minutes. Any questions or comments about any of that?
The hat on the clergyman, they always have that distinctive shape, even into Shakespeare's time and things like that.
Yeah.
And even Thomas Nast cartoons in the 1870s that were anti-Catholic always have an alligator. That's the head of the alligator coming in, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was just kind of curious where they got that design.
Yeah, the bishop the bishop wears three items that are different than priests. He carries the crozier, which is simply the staff of the shepherd. He wears the hat, the mitre, and I'm not going to say that I know exactly where the mitre comes from, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a holdover from Roman days. Okay, the mitre, and then the third thing is a piece of cloth that goes here and then it goes down the back, and that's called the pallium. And I'm not exactly sure of the origins of the pallium either. Okay, I should, but I don't. So you got me, Dick. I can look those up. Yeah.
I can Google.
The foundation or the fundamental reasons for these changes you talked about today, do they come from the monasteries, or are there other councils or committees that decided on making these changes?
Right.
Through the centuries?
Oh, okay. So the question was about what spawned these different changes throughout church history, right? There's all kinds of sources. In some places, it would simply be the bishop of a particular region or diocese. It might be a regional council or regional synod. In other words, all the bishops of southern France or of Belgium. There was no Belgium. You know what I'm saying, though, of that particular area. Then there might be general councils, ecumenical councils, like the Council of Trent or the Council of Florence, or any of the other councils. And there might actually be a decree, from the Pope himself that would initiate a change. The changes of the Second Vatican Council were not actually enacted by the council itself. What they said was that there should be a commission, a liturgical commission set up to initiate these changes. And so, these changes started, during the council. I remember the first English Mass was the first Sunday of Advent in 1964. I might be mistaken, but that, I remember that because my dad was a reader that day, and wow, was he nervous. That was just starting, reading the readings, and they were phased in over a period of years. The addition of extra Eucharistic prayers and communion under both kinds, communion under both species. That didn't come about until 1970 or early 70s, I do believe. So, to answer your question, though, there is just all kinds of ways. You mentioned monasteries. Monasteries were another one. Monasteries were kind of a hotbed of liturgical reform throughout Christian history. In the 20th century, in particular, they helped, they encouraged or experimented with liturgical change. Yeah, Bill?
When did the term Triduum come into being? You talk about Easter week, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, those stuff.
Yeah. I don't know the exact date. I would suspect that the term Triduum, he was asking about the term Triduum for the Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil, celebrations. I would suspect that it came about pretty early. It's a Latin term, I can't give you a specific date, though. All right, I think our work is done here. We've done it. We've gathered again. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.